My name is David Chung, former director of the Nam Center for Korean Studies, and want to welcome everyone to this conference. Thank you to Semio and Francisco Sanin for organizing this really wonderful conference. I'm here to introduce Francisco Sanin, and just want to begin by saying, for many years I would spend my summers in Seoul, and Seoul is a city that we all love and admire. But when you arrive at Incheon Airport, you get this sort of indescribable feeling in the pit of your stomach when you cross the bridges and the highways over the kind of the sea flats going into Seoul. And it's a feeling of you're confronting a giant living organism, the city. It's constantly changing and mutating each year. Buildings that were there a year ago are no longer there, and new ones are built. But it's this notion of the city as a metamorphic entity shaped by many forces, political, cultural, economic, or aesthetic, that I'm interested in learning about at this conference and its presenters, especially our keynote speaker. Francisco Sanin is a Colombian architect and educator with extensive international experience. He is currently professor at the School of Architecture at Syracuse University in New York, where he has previously been the director of its architecture programs in London and Florence, as well as the chair of the graduate program. Sanin has taught in schools across the globe, including Princeton University, the Architecture Association, Universidad UPB in Colombia, and the Korean National University of the Arts in Seoul, among others. Sanin is recognized internationally for his work and research in the history and theory of the city, with particular focus on the political dimension of architecture and urban forms. He has an active practice with works and projects in Latin America, Asia, Europe, and the US. He also has extensive experience in curation and design of exhibitions. In 2011, he was the designer of the Gwangju Biennale, and in 2004 and 2008, he participated in the Korean Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, first as designer and then as co-commissioner with Sung H. Sang. Other works include the Medellin Pavilion for the World Urban Forum in Medellin and Soulscape, an exhibition featuring the work of Korean architects. More recently, he was the curator and the moderator for the City Architects Forum at Seoul Biennial. In 2019, he was the director of the Seoul Biennial of Architecture and Urbanism in Seoul. Please join me in welcoming Francisco Sanin.
Good morning. Thank you for a wonderful introduction. I am too very excited to be here and very much looking forward to the presentations that will follow and the discussions and hopefully the alliances and collaborations that we can forge as the result of this event. I want to acknowledge the invisible crowd that is around us, somewhere all around the world. Hopefully they will be joining us, so welcome all to this fantastic event. I would like to start, obviously, by thanking the NAM Center for this incredible opportunity and invitation. Another shout out to the staff, Kelsey, Kate, Evan. They've been absolutely amazing in making this happen. Incredibly professional, kind, hospitable, and very gentle. And my colleague, Professor Semio, who's done an amazing job, and I would like to have to confess, done most of the job to make this happen, has done a fantastic work, and it's been a pleasure working with you. We have a short time, and I have a big array of images. I work with images. And so I'd like to start by talking about the title, Reclaiming the City. I know it sounds like a war movie. It's like a Second World War movie, tanks rolling in to put a new flag in the town hall of the city. It's not that. It's a much more subtle and probably provocative title that talks about the city as a contested territory. That cities are not single units. They are made of multiple conditions: physical, spatial, political, cultural, and otherwise. It makes me think of Thomas Hobbes, the political scientist, that thinks that we humans have a natural tendency to kill each other, and we need some kind of mediation. He called it politics. So politics becomes this space of negotiation. And so rather than to think about the city as a promise of happiness and utopia, I like to think of the city as a space of conflict and how conflict is productive. How different forms of action, reflection, intervention, participation in the city can construct the dynamics for a better future and imagine possible better futures. We are here to both think as workers who decode, or as my brother would say, decrypt systems of power, systems of conventions, and I like the way he says decrypt because it implies there is something cryptic, it's not always visible, but also to recode it in new forms of practice, new forms of reflections, create new subjectivities, create new alliances, and define new identities and new forms of participation in the city. So I am very much aware that I'm not an expert in any field in Korean architecture, urbanism, history, or culture. So it's with a bit of a humble fear that I approach this presentation more as a not so casual observer, somebody who's passionate about Korea, who fell in love with Korea, but like most love stories, there have been a few dishes broken, a few scars that have been carried away, and a few romances built in the way, and I mean intellectually. My presentation will consist of two parts, some general observations on Korea, as I arrived almost 20 years ago to be a professor, invited professor at KNUA, and then 3 moments of my work as mostly curator and designer with 3 events in the city. So I guess this is what I had in mind coming to Korea. Wonderful, beautiful, elegant architecture, but was fascinated by the way that the city very quickly, through all my conventions, all my preconceptions about what cities are, what architecture is, and how to read the city. So buildings that are completely wrapped in signs, steeples that you can buy and put in your courtyard to symbolize that somewhere there's a church nearby. This is a view from our apartment. Moments of intensity at all kind of scales, shopping malls where you can skate, ride a balloon, you can visit Italy in the subway station, you can get all the amenities of a public space in a single shop, or what I miss the most in Seoul, the stadium of Dongdaemun, and the intense life of market trading that happen, this sense of intense quantity that, as Gore Simmel would say, would produce a new quality, create new subjects, create new relationships, a space where tradition and modernity, whether it is the tomb of the ancestors or promoting a new laptop in Insadong, become part of the rituals of the city. The fact that you can build public space with paper, and that time is as much a designer as it is space and form. A city that continuously has to reinvent itself from its own history to the colonial periods to moments of where we now have places to rent your own suit and get free entrance to the royal palace. But I'm also quite intrigued by the way that this jumpstart modernity hit Korea. This jump from the post-war period to join, let's say, this modern project at a very particular moment where the notions of the city had been changing and evolving, and we have Kim Soo-gun building this amazing experiment, Seon Sanga, right in the middle of an existing city that is still village-like condition. And it straddles two worlds, the reality of Seoul and the idea that modernity as a project can transform and can inform, somehow can convince Seoul to become modern. But Seoul is stubborn. And rather than transforming the city transforms Seoul-sanga. The market crawl inside every crevices, every level of this mega structure and turn it into the most amazing market network where you can find kitchens, where some of the most expensive apartments in the city now are the storage places, where networks of production, distribution, collective agreements, land tenancy are negotiated constantly. So it's an incredible lesson in terms of this project of modernity and the reality and the dynamic of the city, the strength of I guess, the bottom up, if we want to make it that way. But it also works at another level. It connects the mountains, this Seoul-sanga connects the mountains all the way to Namsan. It becomes geographic. It's not only a piece of architecture, it's a piece of landscape that intersects many other, I'm not sure where the pointer is. Do we have a pointer? Yes. Not only it connects the landscape, but it also intersects these large infrastructural systems. So it's no longer a building, it's no longer a city, it's a landscape, it's a piece of infrastructure that connects at different levels with elevated highways, with underground passages that connect metro stations for hundreds and hundreds of meters. That is part of a network of markets where until recently buses would arrive in the middle of the night to pick up clothing to be taken back to whatever place you would come so you can furnish your store, in the process redefining what domesticity might be like. So you would have inside these people that start to live, they have their own maru, they'll have their own TV, their own kettle. Domesticity and social practices begin to change as the result of these quantitative changes of these dynamics. A market that has a sort of hidden, to be revealed, complexity of food, textile, distribution systems, property agreements, collective spaces that now, of course, is in danger of disappearing. As a side note, the people who used to be in Cheonggyecheon that were evicted to create the highway and then the creek were moved out to the north of Seoul to a place called Baeksa. Baeksa Mall is now the subject of another contested effort between the vision of the developer that wants to make this and the city that wants to preserve the original inhabitants and construct something to the scale of their traditional spaces. So I'll move back to maybe probably more than anything to honor the memory of a dear friend who's gone and who I dearly miss, Chung Gi-yeon, who was the commissioner of the Venice Biennale Pavilion, or Korean Pavilion in the Venice Biennale in 2004, not 14, my mistake. At the time, he wanted to talk about the bang, and most people in Korea thought that was rather banal. It was not, fashionable, interesting enough. But he invited me to participate with him to design, I guess, not only so much the physical space as the idea of the place. And we started looking at this sort of, again, we look back at this invention of Seoul, this construction of Gangnam, the sheer quantity of having to accommodate this incredible growth that would transform forever Korea into this apart nation. This repetition of models that some of you have explained in other conferences, arrive in Korea through strange geopolitical processes, models of superblocks, community spaces, sheer quantity that would transform in a matter of years not only the landscape and the physical identity of the city, but the very nature of the social relations that are produced in there. One is obviously fascinated today how that vision now has come to a sort of crude corporate expression where the reality of the part and the reality, I guess, the image of the sales room that pretend to abstract each one of those developments from its actual natural host, the city, to sell this dream. But we were interested in what happens to the domestic, not only to the large scale, but how the domestic sphere has been redefined in the process, both gender roles, nuclear family. So the idea of the bang as some kind of explosion of the domestic into the urban, into the metropolitan, whether it's the PC bang or the Jamshid bang, the convenience store that becomes a sort of living room, an outpost of the domestic that is no longer available, the eating together in a computer screen as a profession, as a service to the community, or the rising prices of property and the extreme competitivity of education and access to to sort of elite universities ending up in phenomena like the Goshiwon, the minimum apartment. Those are not simply isolated pieces. They are part of a dynamic that is a construction of a new form of subjectivity, of being in the city, of relating to each other, that is manifested and articulated in the very physical space that we inhabit. In 2011, I was invited as a designer of the Gwangju Design Biennale. The directors were Ai Weiwei and Sung Hyo-sang. This is a photograph of the airport on our way to Beijing to work in Ai Weiwei's workshop. We used to go there regularly. This was the last time before he was actually put into jail. So he was unable to attend the opening of the Biennale. The Biennale had a very interesting premise to organize or to think about design, not simply as a profession or as a graphic design and industrial design, but as a way of shaping the world, of thinking, of intentionality. And so, although I was the designer and participated, but I was also very interested in things like that. We were looking at design, could be genetic design, being able to produce monkeys that glow in the dark, not as an artificial addendum, but actually genetically engineered to produce that. How we produce specific bodies for a specific sport so they can perform a specific task. But a part of that, and I just bring this up because I know Gwangju is going to come up again today, tomorrow. There was an idea of reframing, remarking, reframing or marking again the edges of the city with 10 permanent pavilions, a sort of legacy of the Biennale that has continued since then. I was asked to do one of them, and this is my little pavilion. It's a useless structure that looks like many things but doesn't work as any of them. It could be a sort of theater. It could be a place to have lunch and have a sandwich. It could be a very intimate private space. It's a sort of amenity for the city, but also it's interesting because in the process I was very intrigued that the site was near the fountain of the uprising and next to an installation of doors that were collected from the village that was destroyed to create the art center. So my proposal was to actually inscribe in the wall of the pavilion the events, the timeline of the events of the uprising, and to have a cast in concrete of the doors to somehow make it permanent the memory of the village that was there. Unfortunately, none of them actually happened. So we ended up with a nice, good-looking architectural pavilion, but edited out, unfortunately. And finally, could I have my coffee, please? Sorry. I'm Colombian. Without coffee, I just don't function. So in 2019, I was invited as the co-director of the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism. And I have to say it was the kind of culmination of many processes that would take a long time to explain here, but I think was an interest from the city of Seoul, from the city government, to confront the transformation from this quantitative growth that had been the landmark, the sort of the hallmark of Seoul, into a moment where demographic growth had stopped, new challenges have come up, and the idea of quality and public space and community and sustainability would come up. So the idea was to create this event that could be used both as some kind of archive research lab, but also network created with many cities around the world to compare and construct relationships of different experiences. As you know, good morning everyone, yes. So the first one, the first Biennale, the first Biennale was the directors were Alejandro Zairapolo and Hyung-Min Pei, who will join us soon after this. Their theme was the commons, imminent commons, the imminent need, something that we all have come to value, recognize, and realize very much. So I was interested in how to create continuity. You know, there are more biennales that are architects or artists. So you end up having the biennales all around the world with more or less the same people. And biennales tend to be like movie houses. One week there's a horror movie, next week there's a love story. And I wanted to work in a way in a biennale that would construct themes and research that could build up over time. So my sense was that if the commons was the what, the collective was the who. You had a political agency of the collective, and to recognize the city as a right, as something that we construct in our relationships that needs to be, as we say before, reclaimed, not from whom, but from what and how. Not only physically, again, it's not the tanks coming in, it's the moments, it's the situations, are the identities, the subjectivities, it's the right to access space, to access service, to be present, to be recognized, to be. So we wanted to look back at the origins of the city as the promise of the collective, the idea that the formal physical space of the city does reflect to the subjectivity it produces or it contains. I was interested in this idea of the collective memory, imagination, action, consciousness, space, living, collective will, collective solidarity, culture, words that somehow hold sort of promise. We also wanted to look back at the commons and how the end of the commons starts with the division of the land, with the most basic architectural moment, the wall. Without the architecture, the commons could not be divided. So architecture and politics are intrinsically linked from the very start. That moment in which the commons are disappear and land is reclaimed as private property, alienated from some and given to others, architecture is there to make its presence, to make its first mark. And it doesn't stop there, of course. It becomes a marker of geographies, nations, classes. We have crises. Capitalism is very good at absorbing crises, but there are the crises. Housing, resolved nowadays with quantities. Refugees, crisis, huge displacements, results of geopolitical fights for resources, for control of trading routes or just natural resources. Climate change. Corporate greed that moves architecture and urban models as they consume markets from Asia to America to Europe and now to Africa, moving models of obsolete urbanization and forms of making cities. Cities held hostage by the few, by corporations, by owners of social media, and now space, the final frontier, also at risk of becoming privatized, of being claimed. Public space that's not public, that it only pretends to be public. Images that promise a publicness and spaces of happiness, but the city is not a place of happiness. The city is a place of conflict, and that is richness. I think that's his promise, and that's what makes it productive. And it is this resolution of conflict, this negotiation, that hopefully hopefully one day could avoid violence and destruction and make it productive. It's always contested. It's a space of expression, of reclaiming identity and presence. But there's always this famous image of a couple pulling a gun on Black Lives Matter marchers to stop them from using their space. So it's in that context that we wanted to understand the Seoul Biennale. We talked about reclaiming the city and redefining architecture, recognizing that architecture as a profession, as a discipline, as a social practice needs to be rethought, that it's dissolving itself and that it needs to reconfigure its method, its aims. So we produce a very simple map of things. The collective. We talk about 3 agencies. Governance, different forms of governance. We wanted to look around the world, examples of governance, whether they were governmental, NGOs, bottom-up, self-organizing, research and speculation. What kind of investigation has been made? What kind of speculation about possible futures? What kind of models, images are being constructed? What kind of social practices? Wow. Okay. I'll go very fast now. Were established around the world. Really, that was the main aim, is to understand the city under these 3 different lights. And as you can see, it's a theme that we're carrying on in this conference, as it has engaged with literature, movie, film, art, artwork, artivism, research. So I will move very quickly because I just got my 5-minute warning, and in Colombian I'll take 6. But we have 4 themes in the Biennale. The cities, a network of cities. We invited cities from all around the world. Soul Lab, the presence of the Biennale in the city. Then we have, the Soul Lab was the universities that from all over the world. The on-site programs, and then the thematic, which is the part that I took, let's say, more care of. So we invited cities from all over the world to look at, particularly we wanted to make it a global platform. We didn't want the traditional architectural biennale, which is mostly Western-centric, where it's sort of in a colonial view look, the global South is invited in a sort of folkloric guise. We wanted to recognize that some of the most interesting experiments in architecture and urbanism today were taking place in areas that are not part of that center, from Addis Ababa to Colombia to Medellin to Southeast Asia. Universities from all over the world were invited. And I work with Professor Beth Hughes, who's the chair of the Royal College of Art in London, to work on the thematic exhibition. We invited practitioners, groups from all over the world, from Mexico, bringing their research into housing, to alternatives of transformation of cities, public spaces, collective living, different forms of collective this is in Colombia, in Finland, in India, new forms of collectivity organizing both in terms of housing, territories, natural resources. In Bangladesh, aluminum and its role in the construction of the city. In Bahrain, my whole hometown of Medellin, Belgrade, Albania, China, new rural landscapes as negotiations with the city in Japan, reflections on the rural policy of construction in China, food networks in Brazil, glass production as an image or as a dream in the architectural industry, reflections on the Bang in Korea and the Goshiwon, technology and redistribution of resources by Keller Easterling, transformation of spaces in Korea, places to meet, spaces to dialogue between one and the other. These are just images of the actual installation of the Biennale. It was surrounded with a ramp where we had some of the exhibitions, and we created a number of curated movies on the city, so as you move in, you have the simultaneity of exhibit, movies, and spaces to look, to read, to study, to interact with the city. But most importantly, we wanted the Biennale to be a place to discuss, to reflect, to interact, to construct networks, something I'm hoping very much, and I know that will be the case, will be taken on today, to construct new forms of collective collaboration where we leave our own individual institutional silos, and we are not singularly multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but we actually reach across to invent and perhaps imagine new forms in which we can practice the city. As any good film, I need to end with the credits. This is the team that work on the thematic exhibition. This is obviously our press photograph, the little heart. The reality is a different one, but a much richer one. Endless night, no sleep, hard work in the basement, working really hard. But at the end of the day, that's what it takes to make Reclaiming the City. 28 seconds to spare. Thank you very much.